helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, certified Christian counselor and director of Ottawa's Elim Counselling Services.
Hi, I'm Michael Hart, director of Elim Counselling Services, a Christian counseling ministry in Ottawa, and I want to thank you for listening to this edition of Life Transformation, a Christian counseling radio show where chains are broken and the lives are renewed. If you're not familiar with Elim Counseling, you can learn more about us at elimcounselingministry.com. Basically, we are a Christian counseling organization that provides professional counseling for individual couples and families. And with me in studio today is Rick Lecuyer, and we'll be discussing another interesting topic today. Today we want to look at abusive relationships. Welcome, Rick.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's good to be here again on air with you.
Right, so today as our text, Rick, we are looking at 1 Samuel 25, and we don't have time to read the entire chapter that involves Nabal and Abigail, what I would call a very unusual couple. But I want to read maybe just a few verses, verse 2 and 3 of chapter 25, and then maybe also verse 23 and 25, because it gives us some very important insights that we can discuss further when we talk about abusive relationships. So verse 2 and 3 of 1 Samuel 25 says, "There was a certain man in Maon who carried on his business in the region of Carmel. He was very prosperous, 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and it was sheep shearing time in Carmel. The man was Nabal, as a Calebite, and his wife's name was Abigail. The woman was intelligent and good-looking, the man brutish and mean." Any insights on that, Rick? When you hear these verses, what comes to you?
Well, it's interesting when you get involved in looking at some of these topics. You can always turn to the Word of God and find an account, that relates and so on. And I just kind of wonder sometimes how you could have, in this particular case, you have Abigail, who's intelligent, a beautiful woman, and so on, and she gets into this relationship with a guy that's like surly and brutish and mean and so on.
Yes.
You just kind of wonder, how does that happen, And you see that in the Word of God. You see it today. I mean, you also see these things happening today, and you always scratch your head and go, how does that happen? How do people get themselves stuck into these kinds of relationships and so on,
I guess there is some truth to this saying that opposites attract, right? Because if you look at their character, it's they're quite opposites, right? Abigail is intelligent, she's beautiful, and as we read further on in the story, we see that she's also a kind-hearted woman. But if you look at the character of Nabal, we see that he's mean and is very uncaring. And the rest of the story sort of points to the consequences that results from actions such as his.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that, and I think you've heard it said before that where your heart is and what you worship are the same. It seems to me that his heart is definitely not in the right place. It seems to be it's in his wealth and what he can make and so on. And he has those kinds of characteristics and so on.
I think it would be good for us to maybe not read the rest of the story, but just give the listeners a sort of recap of how this story unfolds, because we have here just the verses that I read that talks about the qualities of both spouses. But the rest of the story tells us that David's men were very kind to Nabal's shepherds, and that at a certain point in time, David requests a favor in a time of need. But instead of reciprocating kindness to David, what we found is that Nabal insulted David. And a conflict was on the horizon, where there was impending bloodshed because David's men had swords drawn, 400 of them, and they were on their way to slaughter Nabal and his men. But Abigail got a word of it, what was happening, what the insult that David had been inflicted on David by her husband. And she got a hold news of this through a servant, and Abigail intervened by setting out on a journey to give to David and his men the supplies immediately.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So she knew that there was a crisis coming, and here we have this woman taking it up on her shoulder to stand between an army of 400 armed men and her husband and his men. And as the story unfolded, we see that she was successful in preventing the bloodshed.
She saved a lot of people's lives that day.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I kind of wonder, Michael, what are the factors that, lead a person to unknowingly become involved with an abusive partner? How do they get themselves into those kinds of relationships? What happens?
Yes, I think there are a number of factors that we can point to, and that's a very good question, because we see that even in counseling today, we have partners who are totally opposites. They're totally opposite end of the spectrum. So one of the factors that leads to a person becoming in a relationship with an abusive partner is where abuse is familiar to that person. So there may have been something in Abigail's past that made abuse familiar to her. It could be an abusive father, it could be an abusive mother, it could be abusive brothers. But what we find when we do in sessions, in therapy sessions with our client, when we do family of origin work, and we see that the one partner is being abused, and we start looking at the family history and asking about, what are some of the negative events in your childhood that comes to mind? What sort of memory comes up from your relationship with your siblings or with your parents? What we often find is that people who end up being in abusive relationships as adults had a past where abuse was familiar.
Yeah. So abuse being things like where they're told that they're never going to measure up, or they're just never going to be good enough, or they just see that kind of thing, and then it just is almost like a self-perpetuating thing, and then then they end up getting sort of stuck in these kinds of relationships and so on.
Yes, so there's a familiar pattern there, because if you have a father who is telling you that, for example, the scenario that you raise, you are no good, or that you can never amount to anything, or other insults like that, when you meet a partner and you're going through, let us say, the dating process, and that first insult take place, someone who is not familiar with that would say, I am out of here. This is very uncomfortable territory for me.
Yeah, what are you talking about? That's not true. That's not me.
It doesn't fit. It's certainly unfamiliar for someone who I love and I'm close to talk to me that way. But if it's familiar, there is this tendency to minimize it and to say things like, I know the person still loves me. Maybe they're just having a bad day, and so they go. The relationship continues to marriage, and then in marriage we have the person becoming even more abusive, because now they feel that their behavior is accepted. Whereas on the other hand, someone who is not familiar with that kind of abuse would end the relationship when the abuse starts in the first place.
I mean, you read the account in 1 Samuel 25 in Abigail's situation. I mean, she immediately made this decision to stand in the gap. She went ahead and did that, and got all kinds of food and wine skins and and all that stuff to take to David's army to stop them.
Yes.
But she didn't take any time to tell Nabal what she was going to do, because she knew what his response was going to be. And
absolutely.
She'd been living with that and understood that. So I guess that's part of that.
Absolutely. It's kind of interesting that two things happen in that story that points to the fact that Nabal was not a man that people were comfortable talking to or confronting about confronting when he did something wrong. The first was that the servants knew about it, but they did not speak to him. They spoke to
they went directly to her.
They went to Abigail.
We're not talking to him. We know what he's going to say.
Yes,
we're going to go to her because she's the one that's got some intelligence, and she understands this kind of stuff, and her mindset is definitely
absolutely
different.
She's the one who will listen. So first we have the servants who is not talking to Nabal because they know he wouldn't listen, but then we also so have Abigail not going to her husband and saying, "What is this that you have done? How could you have insulted David? Why don't you go and apologize to David and take the supplies to him?" We don't have that. So that gives us insight into the fact that she felt that it was futile to say anything to her husband. Instead, what we have is that this woman took it upon herself to go and stand between 400 soldiers and her husband. And I think that is very, very telling. And it's also a pattern that we see often in abusive relationships that we call enabling or codependency, where the spouse that is more kind-hearted or the spouse that is abused often takes it upon themselves to prevent the consequences falling on the abusive spouse.
Sure.
So in today's culture, it might not be that the person's life is in jeopardy, but it could be it could be something where the person would lose their job if the other spouse did not cover up. An example of that would be alcoholics, for example, where someone repeatedly do not turn up for work because they have hangover the morning after drinking too much or after doing drugs. And then we have the enabling spouse who would call the workplace to say, "My husband or my spouse my wife is not coming in today because they're sick or they have a migraine headache and they have a toothache." They can't talk.
Whatever it takes to cover it up.
Whatever it takes. So I am calling on behalf of that person. And when you find that happening, then you have a scenario plays out where there are repeating scenarios like this, where one spouse is constantly carrying the burden of the relationship, houting fire with neighbors, patching up things with the in-laws, and it becomes a burden. So the story in 1 Samuel 25 captures, there's one scene there that captures the burden that Abigail was carrying, or that spouses who enable sometimes takes upon themselves. It's this picture of her going down a ravine with her donkeys laden with supplies, and David's army coming on the other side of the ravine with weapons drawn. 400 men strong. Coming towards her. And that's a very graphic scene, and I think this captures what some spouses have to go through to constantly bail out their abusive partner and to keep the relationship going. And sometimes it doesn't have to be, the burden doesn't have to be necessarily with others, but it can be the cover-up, living the lie, going to church on Sundays with a big smile on your face, knowing very well that you're hurting and that inside you are dying, but you have to present this image and this face that we are a loving couple. So they have to have the arms around the shoulder, or looking very loving to give that image, to cover up for the hurt and the pain that is inside.
And you see that her judgment of this, of what his reaction was. She didn't go to see him because she knew exactly what his response would be.
Yes.
And you see further on in the story, by the time you get down to verse 36 or so, after she meets David and kind of gets things put back on track and gets back onto his good side, actually saves out her husband's life and the male servants' lives and so on. She goes back to tell him, and he basically, it looks like he basically has a major stroke or a heart attack. Or says he just went dead, like he was like a stone.
Yes.
And so, and then he died a few days
died shortly
afterwards.
Yep.
And her judgment of that, she knew exactly what his response would have been if she had gone to him at the beginning and so on.
It could be that maybe he worked up himself into this fit of rage and ended up having a heart attack, because maybe he was insulted by the fact that she, as the wife, took it on herself to go and talk to David on his behalf and made him look bad, because he, in those days, it it would be the men who would be responsible for those kind of things. So we don't have necessarily a lot of insight from the story itself that tell what happened, but I would imagine that he was maybe in some fit of rage that led to a heart attack. If you have just joined us, you're listening to the Life Transformation Radio Show, and I'm your host, Michael Hart of Elam Counselling Services. And with me in studio today is Rick Lecuyer, and we are discussing the story of Abigail and Nabal, and the topic of today's show is abusive relationships. So Rick, you had asked me earlier, what are the factors that may let a person unknowingly become involved with an abusive partner? And I had said that when abuse is familiar, it is easy for that that's one of the reasons why it takes it. But there are some other reasons as well. And one other reason is a dysfunctional template from the family of origin between the mother and the father in the family of origin. So if you're from a household where you had an abusive father, the father did not necessarily abuse you, but you saw abuse between your mother and your father, and you saw your mother being the enabler or the codependent spouse who allowed that abuse to continue, then there's a template that is formed in your brain that say, this is okay. Wow. This is how a wife should be treated, or this is how a husband should be treated. So when you find yourself in an adult relationship where emotional abuse starts taking place, it's as if the template in your brain say, this matches fits. Up. This fits. Yeah. This fits.
Wow, the brain's a strange thing.
Yes, and if the opposite were true, where there is not such a template, many spouses would say, this cannot continue. I will not continue in this relationship in this state. We have to get help, and whatever it takes to fix this, we are going to get it fixed. But it's just not okay for you to abuse me in the way that you're abusing me, and to say the kind of things that you say.
So, someone that's always seen their parents in a really loving, supportive relationship.
Yes.
If they marry someone like a Nabal, and they're you're right. So the template doesn't fit, and they go, so right away it raises the flag, and they go, hey, just a second, this isn't correct, this isn't right, and so then they know they need to deal with that.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a tension there between what they're familiar with and what they're experiencing in their relationship, and that tension causes them to say, no, this doesn't fit. This needs to change. But if there's a familiarity, they will just continue being abused over and over. And then there are other reasons, such as negative self-concept or low self-esteem, where for whatever reason, a person who has low self-esteem doesn't have to be from the family of origin. It can be from issues of being abused on the school ground, on the playground, at school, where they were made to feel less than, they were teased by other kids because they had freckles, or because they were the child that dressed differently. So abuse is familiar, and they develop this negative self-concept of themselves.
I always felt that teachers had such an important role to play in kids' lives, to be supportive and build kids up and kind of thing. And I've always been like, wow, if you're in a teaching position, you're in a really, to me, almost like a sacred role. You've got to be the right kind of person to take a kid, and because if you're abusive and a teacher in that role, I mean, think of how many kids' lives you're going to affect, and if they get that template in their head, so
then they're going to live it out in adult life. So when the Bible say, train up a child in the way that he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. It doesn't necessarily mean just in words only, but also how we act around children. But when it comes to words, what we say to children is also a way of training up that child, not necessarily the deliberate training, but things that we say have an effect. So children who are criticized over and over, when they're old, it is hard for them to depart from the template that says my actions are useless, I'm never going to succeed, it doesn't matter what I do, it's futile. So parents who are overcritical, or who sends the message that 85 is not good enough, and they're later surprised when the child stops trying or giving up. They're surprised. Well, the child has learned that it doesn't matter what kind of effort I put in, I am going to be criticized. And so when they're old, they get into this pattern of not trying, giving up on life, settling for mediocrity, because they are not departing from the messages that were sent in childhood that you can never achieve anything that's worthwhile.
Right.
So we have to be very careful about the messages that we send to our children, because the negative self-concept that will form is very hard to get away from in adulthood. And another factor that answers your question, Rick, as to what are the factors that may lead a person to unknowingly become involved with an abusive partner is a subconscious mechanism that has to do with what they call, quote, attempt at correcting the past, unquote. So there is this belief that when we have an abusive parent or we suffer abuse in childhood, we go through life looking for an attempt to try to correct that. So if you have an abusive father that made you feel unloved, and your desire, the natural desire, is that I want to get my father to love me. I want to move from being abused, from my father to change from being abusive to be a father who shows me love and kindness.
Yes.
The subconscious mechanism that kicks in end up with that person finding an abusive spouse.
Wow.
In an attempt to try to get that spouse to become loving. So they're trying to finish the unfinished business of their childhood. And it's not a deliberate action. But what's amazing is that when we look at the studies and we look at the stats for this, it seems very true that a lot of time people in adulthood end up choosing spouses that were like their abusive parents.
Wow. Incredible.
So if we go back to the story of Abigail and Nabal, there might be some conclusions that we can draw from that there might have been something in Abigail's past that made her familiar with abuse and made her stay in that relationship and made her comfortable in staying with Nabal. In Abigail's past, it made her stay with Nabal, even though he was, as the scripture said, he was such a mean and brutish man. If you have just joined us, you're listening to the Life Transformations radio show, and I'm your host, Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Services. If you would like to learn more about Elim, you can visit us at elimcounselingministry.com, and that's Elim with two Elim, E-L-I-M, and counseling with 2 L's, elimcounselingministry.com. We can also be reached at 613-699-1677. And with me in studio today is Rick Lecuyer, and we have been discussing the story of Nabal and Abigail from 1 Samuel 25. And we have been talking so far about the emotional abuse in relationships using this biblical passage, and we have looked at how sometimes opposites attract, where in the story we have Abigail, an intelligent and beautiful woman, finding herself in a relationship with Nabal, who was brutish and mean. And we were discussing what are some of the factors that lead a person to unknowingly become involved with an abusive partner. And so far, Rick, I have touched on 4 points that covers that.
4 very interesting points.
Yes, and I'll just go over them quickly for the listeners who have just joined us, and you can listen to the podcast online on Elim's website or on the CHRI website. So the first thing that I said that leads to people being in abuse, unknowingly ending up with abusive partners, that they had a past where abuse is familiar. It may have been an abusive parent or abuse on the playground. I also said that the second reason people end up with abusive partners, that there is a dysfunctional template from family of origin where they may have seen abuse between a mother and a father. And I said also, thirdly, that there might have been negative self-concept as a result of experiences that a person have suffered early in life that say, that made them have low self-esteem, that may make them feel this is the only person that I can get. I'll never get anyone else, so I will stick with this person regardless of what they do to me. And then I said that there is a subconscious mechanism that kicks in where we sometimes attempt to correct the dysfunction of the past. So we end up finding abusive spouses who were like our abusive parent in a way of trying to make them love us in the way that we wanted our father or mother to love us. And this makes a lot of sense, because we sometimes, Rick, what we find in session, I'll have women who come in and they will say something like, I can't understand, I'm only attracted to bad guys.
Yeah.
If someone is good and loving,
and you hear that a lot too. Oh yeah, well, we know all about her. She's attracted to the bad boys, and you hear a lot of that kind of thing, and
Right. So it makes sense when you think about the attempt of correcting the past, because when you look at the past of these women, you'll find that they had mean and abusive partners. So Rick, we have almost come to the end of today's broadcast, and I want to thank you very much for joining us today. And for your listeners, I want to thank you for listening to this show. And the good news is that next week, this is a 2-part episode on emotional abuse. Next week, we'll be looking at what are some of the forms that emotional abuse takes in relationships. We'll also be looking at the profile of an emotional abuser, and more important, we'll be looking at what are some of the steps that a person can take to heal from emotional abuse. So don't miss next week's show, because we'll be looking at this episode in this topic in more detail. Thank you very much for being with us here, Rick.
Always a pleasure, Michael. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. And if you have a question, if you have been listening to the Life Transformation Radio Show and you have a question that you'd like to ask us, my name is Michael Hart of Elim Counselling Services, and you can reach us at 613-699-1677. Again, it's 613-699-1677. You can also visit us online at elimcounselingministry.com, where you can find more contact information such as our email, and you can also send us questions by email. If you'd also like us to present a workshop at your church, or to present a certain topic on the radio show, then you can let us know as well. So we have come to the end of today's broadcast, and thank you very much for joining us on air today, and tune in next week when we will continue part 2 of emotional abuse. Until next time, I pray that God would bless you in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart. God bless you, and thank you very much for listening.